Okay. Cooperative Legacy Project interview number 10, June 16th, 2005. We're visiting with Harlan Severson, rural electric pioneer, is it fair to call you that? And author of Stepping Forward Boldly, the 25th anniversary history of East River Electric Power Cooperative, published in 1975. Yeah. Harlan, where and when were you born?
February 2nd, 1924. Is this working?
Yes. And where was that at?
On a farm southwest of Chester, South Dakota.
Okay. Where was your family originally from? I suspect Norwegian. Maybe.
My father was from Inwood, Iowa.
Oh, okay.
Son of a homesteader back in the 1870s and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
My mother was from Dakota, Iowa. All four of my grandparents were Norwegian immigrants.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you have brothers and sisters? Did you have brothers and sisters?
Yes, I have. I had two sisters, both of whom are dead.
Okay. What are some of your earliest memories from the farm when you were a kid?
We were moved off the farm. My earliest memories is living in a farmhouse just southeast of Chester. My father was forced off the farm in those later years, like 1927, 28, when a lot of others were forced off the farm. My father was also a concrete, he did concrete work of all kinds.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember that farmhouse being in. My dad would go to town in a wagon or sled and pick up groceries or the papers or something. Mm-hmm. And I remember looking out the window when he was coming home and that. We still had one team and one sleigh or buggy or whatever. Mm-hmm. That was my earliest memory.
Yeah. No electricity or anything like that out there then.
Nobody had electricity there until 1945, maybe.
Mm-hmm. What sort of person was your mother?
She was a daughter of a farmer and near Dakota, Iowa, and she moved to town, and she was a great cook. And I was a younger of two sisters, and so I was the pet, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I just started a little biography about World War II,
mm-hmm.
and one of the things it's just for my children, essentially.
Sure.
But I point out that neither of my parents ever disciplined me in any way.
Yeah.
They never told me, do this, do that.
Mm-hmm.
And they should have disciplined me, but because I was a pet, I grew up without discipline.
Yeah. I've asked this to some of the other people I've interviewed. Do you think that your background and perhaps the Scandinavian background had some influence on you being involved in cooperatives and that kind of thing later on?
No, I can't say it was family-oriented. It was occupation-oriented or influenced.
Mm-hmm.
Or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Okay. When you were young, what did you want to do? Did you want to farm or did you want to do something else? You did something else.
By the time I got to the 7th or 8th grade, I had a trumpet, and then I moved to Madison, had a bass horn. But I didn't have any thoughts about that at all when I was at that age.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, you said you should have been disciplined. Did you do something that you should have been disciplined for?
Well, in high school, I skipped classes. I started playing in dance bands, and went to a fifth year in high school and went into the Army at that point. This was 1943, 42, 43. And I learned discipline. Not totally, but all of us has to go through that self-discipline, and it was the Army helped me do that.
Where did they end up sending you to?
Oh, my final thing was a combat infantry outfit in France.
Okay.
Toward the end of the war.
Okay.
The tail end of 1944-45.
Okay. Was that? Then you went from here over there to do that?
Yeah, I went through basic training. Those of us who got 130 on this test they gave us, which the Army considered was an IQ test, I got 130. They had to have 115 or more to be an officer. I got 130. All of those who got 130 or above were assigned to an Army Special Training Program. And it was either engineering, medical, or language that they wanted, after the war ended or something. Mm-hmm. And that, the Army decided, in the case of the engineering students, I was at the School of Mines for 3 months, I guess it was, that we didn't need engineers anyhow. They're not going to get done in time for this war. So they signed us all to the infantry. We went from School of Mines dormitories to northern Louisiana. Mm-hmm. From Louisiana, we went to France.
Okay. And what part of France were you at then? In the northern?
Alsace-Lorraine.
Okay. And that was not necessarily involved in the Battle of the Bulge?
It wasn't the big battle, but we the unit I was in a Bulge battle. It was kind of the German last effort after losing the Bulge, and they sent like 10-1 troops against us, and 30 of the guys. We lost a number of people or a number of guys, but we held them back not long enough so that they didn't get. That effort failed. That was another. It was a smaller battle of the Bulge, but it was. We lost. I don't know, hundreds of the division I was in.
Yeah.
I didn't get hit there. I had some close calls.
Mm-hmm. And you got out in the military?
I got out in 1946.
Okay. And then did you
I went to General Beadle 1 year. Only it was Dakota State College now, 1 year. Went 1 year as sophomore, and then I went 2 more years at Beadle. And Beadle at Dakota State. And my junior and seniors, I started working part-time for the Madison Daily Leader. Mm-hmm. And then I went to Dunwoody, and I was thinking of being a weekly owner at the time.
Mm-hmm. That's in the Twin Cities, is it?
Yeah.
Dunwoody, yeah.
And I got up to linotype and went through the hand stuff, and got up to linotype, decided this isn't for me, but by that time I had 2 kids. and Merrill Hunter was later the publisher of that. And Merrill had been working at the desk, and he got called back into the Marines. And I'd worked part-time at the Leader before, and George Hunter, the publisher, called me in Minneapolis and said, "Do you want to come back?" And I said, "I sure do." Our car broke down, and so I took over the desk there for roughly 2 years before the Highliner started. And then I was the first editor of the Highliner.
Okay, and what year was that then?
1952.
1952.
And one of my best friends there was Bill Porter, who died here. He was a lawyer. His partner in Sodak Sports was Al Newharth.
Oh.
And Al was in the back. We were arguing about who got the stones, you know. You know what I'm talking about. But Newharth was there in our back room, same time I was in a lot of time. Bill Porter was from Madison, a high school friend.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where Al Newharth put together Sodak Sports. Then they took it up to Aberdeen to publish or print it. Newharth was well, you know all the Newharth stories. But he linotype operators said what was they had like batting averages, and the linotype operators say, "What's so and so? You don't have that batting average," and Newharth would have it, you know, like that. Yeah. And you know the whole Newharth story.
So how long did you do the Highliner then?
The Highliner, I did it as an employee also of East River until I think it was 1960 when I went to work for East River.
Mm-hmm.
Or it might have been before that. Might have been sometime in the 50s. And then I went over East River and I did the PR back to, and you know, we were promoting use of electric power in those days because the more we could go to the Bureau of Reclamation, that was then, and say we need this amount of power, we'd get an allocation of power. And any kilowatt that we got, and then it would be kind of ours, you know. And so we promoted the use of power by buying an electric home freezer or whatever, and I did that. Mm-hmm. But then we got involved in power supply.
Yeah,
when the Republicans got in there in the first instance, this is all in various various histories. They said the government doesn't have any utility responsibility. We're not going to provide you anything other than your allocation of hydropower. That's when there was this great push for consumer-owned, cooperatively owned power supply. Mm-hmm. Andy Freeman was manager of Dakota up in North Dakota, and Andy Freeman was doing the same thing. He was trying to get a loan for a generating plant, but all he was going to do, it was just a North Dakota thing. He didn't think regionally at that point, and he was opposed to it to beat heck, and that's when Ken Hullum got into the thing too. He was an East River person. Art Jones, you know all about Art Jones, I presume, got into it.
But you want to talk about, go ahead, about individuals, because what I know on tape.
Ken Hullum ran for Senate a couple of times, you know that, and you've read this story or know about it. But it was Ken Hullum who, because of his farm background, because he was a debater, because he'd run for the Senate and so forth, got appointed as Assistant Secretary of Interior. But before that, he was on the Missouri Basin Survey Commission. It was a group appointed in, check the year on this exactly, it was like in 1952. There was like 9 various people. One of them was the publisher of Lincoln Paper. A couple of senators on it. Milt Young was on it. and they conducted hearings throughout the whole Missouri Basin about management and running the dams. And that commission, if you ever could find a copy of this, it'd be the report of the Missouri Basin Commission. And they recommended that there be a federal commission that would be appointed by, it would take legislation to be, and they'd appoint a commission who would manage the whole Missouri River development thing. Mm-hmm. And one of their recommendations was integration of thermal power with the hydropower. And Ken went through all of these meetings. He wrote the chapter on Wahi in it. And when the initial efforts to get this unit, Lee Olds was brought into it. Lee Olds was ex-chairman of the Federal Power Commission at the time. And that's where this giant power thing came about.
He was with Roosevelt, the Roosevelt administration? Olds?
Oh, no, this was Truman days.
Oh, okay, Truman.
And it was Ken's leadership as one time executive of the new Midwest Electric Consumers Association. We were just meeting here this past week that he went to Udall, and the primary decision was this, that Basin had this application in for $34 million to build this first big generating plant up in North Dakota. And Minn Kota was against it. Humphrey what was Minn Kota for a little while because Minn Kota was serving a couple of co-ops over in Minnesota. And so Ken had the problem. And then 14 power companies went together and said, we could provide your power. And there was a letter into Secretary Udall that will, with the use of your hydro system or your transmission system, will provide, you don't need this plant that's being proposed by these cooperatives. And in that Holem book, you'll see a picture of me and Art Jones and Ken Holem and Secretary Udall. That's when Udall signed a letter to the 14 power companies. It was to the Northern States Power Company president that said, we reject your offer. Norman Clapp was the RA administrator and said, just made the REA loans, made it feasible, because the Bureau also did a few things. They provided water for, that is, it had to be, should be near a water place, but they also stood by. When the new plant would go down, then the Bureau the Bureau of Reclamation would stand by for as a power source until everything was working again. And there was lots of other things involved in all that, but it was because and probably this isn't in print, I don't think, but the other thing that made that all feasible was that Quentin Burdick was the first United States senator to back John F. Kennedy, and it's in Rogers' book, incidentally. And as a result of that, and the fact that Kennedy needed somebody out here, he needed some states out here, and he owed Burdick, and Clinton was backing that. Milt Young wasn't, but understandably he was the other. Incidentally, Milt Young was on that Missouri River Basin Survey Commission. And as a result of Quintenberg to a marked degree. And the fact that Kennedy had that, that's how Basin was possible. That was 200 megawatts. Now it's 200 was 2,000, but now it's it was 200 to start with. Now they have 10 times that amount. It's the power companies always got greedy.
Yeah. Why did you think that they maintained that attitude? They never really intended or wanted to provide electric power to rural people, but they were always opposed to every development that would deliver that. Why do you think that was?
Oh, why did it go?
Yeah. Just greed, or what?
Oh, it was primarily because the power company always had more political power, and in those days the Army engineers were powerful, but they're not, now so much anymore. But it was not the Democrats. The Democrats were all right on all of this stuff in those days, but we were socialists and all kinds of evil things, to have a consumer-owned major facility like that. And Northern States Power Company in those days was the industry leader on the other side. Now, Northern States is part of, it's been sold and part of something else. Basin Electric now is the dominant power supply in about 8 or 9 states, whatever it is. And Art Jones, a farmers union, all of Art Jones's stories.
No, not necessarily.
One story is worth repeating. Not story, one comment I'd make
Sure.
is that one of the advantages of Basin in those early days was that either Verge Hanlon at East River, but primarily Art Jones, who was then president of East River, knew enough and was glib and smart enough to be the spokesman for Basin. And not Andy Freeman didn't have a president like that, or nor did anybody else. Art knew enough about it, his relationship with Ken, or his relationship as East River president with Verge Hanlon, so he could be a spokesman, which had a more political strength in it than one of the hired hands, or one of the engineers, or one of the professionals. But he could speak, and that was a strength we had with Art's leadership, and he knew enough about the issue too. One quick example was that there was a time then after we basically had its first unit, then they were going to build another one for 400 megawatts rather than 200. And the engineer one time in a Bismarck meeting had come up with a plan for this 400 megawatt unit. And the engineer who had prepared that, one of the assistant engineers who had planned that, came up with a price at the end twice of as costly as what they were getting out of the 200. And this was going to be presented to the board of directors. And the number one engineer hadn't read his what he was, and another guy in the firm had developed that in those days the bigger the better and the cheaper, and the bigger and the better, twice as big, the price was going to increase by 2. And the engineer that was going to present that hadn't read it carefully enough, and Art Jones went to this number one engineering consultant said, "You mean to tell us we're going to go to twice the size and twice the investment, and not get the benefits of higher stuff, benefits of size?" And the guy just hit his head and said, "I don't know how he came about those numbers." And then he looked it over, and he said, "Yeah, you're right, Art." And then he had to go and do the numbers again. And what they what the error was, that they underestimated the value of what they call residuals, which was energy and stuff that could be sold. But Art caught that. And he was later president of the basin, as you know, and this was a farmer without just a high school education. Was a minority leader in the Senate too for a while, state Senate. Mm-hmm. And anyhow, that's not the. There have been other farmer directors, leaders of various things, but Art was the leader of Basin in a lot of ways that it was necessary to have a leadership of that quality, because now it's about Basin. I don't have to give it. And Art made that possible. Along, I think of three people. Burge Hanlon, who's East River.
Yeah.
Art Jones, who was East River. Mm-hmm. Ken Holum. Mm-hmm. That triumvirate. Yeah. The leadership that created Basin, and today, it's a. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But you want to talk a little bit? One of the things I like to do is ask about people. Do you want to talk a little bit about Burge Hanlon as a person?
Yeah. Oh, what about him?
As a person, what sort of person was he, and why was he so successful?
I'll tell you a story, but not on that.
Okay.
When Ken was running for Senate the first time, Ondal was Assistant Secretary of Interior, and he issued a Basin marketing criteria. It violated the preference idea, and it was a lousy hydropolicy. The companies would get more of it and so forth.
This was Fred Ondal.
Fred Ondal, yeah. And this is kind of a fun story. And Kenny Holmes, when East River's first day, we had director, manager, committees, three of them. One of us would. We had a PR committee. We had a power supply committee. There was a rural electric manager named Kenny Holmes from Plankerton, South Dakota, and he was manager of this distribution cooperative, and he was about 5 feet tall and sort of a Republican sycophant. And when Ondal had issued this, he went into D.C. and met with Ondal, and Ondal had this guy come over from the Bureau or whatever, this Republican did, and they issued a press release with Harold Lovery, Ondal, and Kenny Holmes, who was chairman of the subcommittee at East River Power Supply Committee. They put out a press release, and they said everything's kosher, everything's good now, everything's been worked out, so you're going to have power forever. And that, quoting Harold Lovery, the congressman, Kenny Holmes and Ondel. Only they spelled Kenny Holmes Holum. and Ken, that was what Ken was running. So now there was another meeting in Minneapolis when I was Hannon's number one exec at the time, or just wanting to interface with him. And you tell his story to somebody, but don't publish it. And there was a meeting in Minneapolis. Kenny Holmes called up Verge and said, "Can I come up to your room?" And he said, "Yeah, come on up." And so Kenny Holmes came in and abjectly said, "I want you to forgive me, Verge, for this." And he got down on his knees, Verge said, and asked him to forgive him for this. And now, Kenny Holmes and Harlan are the same size, see? And he told me that story on the way home, but I never repeated it. And then now, 10 years later, Harlan and I and a friend named Clay Cochran, that's a long story too, were up in a Washington, D.C. hotel, and Harlan was just on Holmes' ass like nothing. I don't know what the hell he was bitching about, but he was carrying on for about an hour, giving Holmes bullshit, And then it occurred to Harlan, I'd never told the story about Kenny Holmes, instantly. And so he got into that point of the about his getting down on his hands and knees to apologize, and Holmes for the first time, and said, "Well, that was nice then, Verge. You could look him right in the eye." Generally, Harlan was that fast all the time, but so was Holum,
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I think, the leadership of those two and Art Jones is why that thing exists in North Dakota now. And Senator Burdick in that period, Senator Burdick could be a real horse's ass too. And
if that hadn't happened, what would have happened to rural electrification in this area?
I'm sorry?
If you hadn't gotten that done, what would have happened to rural electrification in this area? Would it be what it is today?
It would be we probably would have it would have been smaller units. What Basin did was provide the same electrical system and benefits TVA was doing for the Tennessee area. Mm-hmm. It was that regional that made it possible for the rural electric power supply to take advantage of the economies of scale, and a unit that for under the first 15, 25 years of Basin had a social conscience as well, a social they did what they could do with some of the resources that they had, and they continued that. And otherwise, it would have been East River have a generating plant, or Minn Kota to have Minn Kota still got one, but it was developed on the difference primarily is a regional approach to power supply rather than individual plants, and there was economy of scale, which and an organization that can provide as an example now, wind. It's got benefits, but it's got limitations too, of course. That can be developed because of the transmission system that was also developed. And the thing that made Basin possible was the decision of Interior at the time, first of all, to provide the basic transmission system to deliver that power, but also the contract between Basin and the Bureau of Reclamation in that period was for the federal government through the river system to back up if the Basin plant went down. For a power supply organization like Dakota or anybody else, you not only have to have the power supply for whatever, but you have to have it backed up someplace. There's another group, Northern States was having at the time, where the power companies put together their transmission system, and Minneapolis was the kind of hub of all this, or the organization, and what concurrent with the creation of the generating plant was a thing also called the Missouri Basin Systems Group. That came into being at the same time, and that provided the organization and the facilities for getting this power went not only to rural electric cooperatives, but for municipalities, Nebraska Public Power System, and all that. That came into being at the same time, and that was what Ken Holm put together. But there was a person on his staff who had developed the same type of system in New England before this, who put together the Missouri Basin Systems Group.
Yeah.
And that's still existing, and Basin is developing wood power too. And, wind power. Wind is, if you don't know this, might be interesting to you. Wind doesn't provide any capacity. It provides essentially coal. That is, instead of burning coal, you harness the wind. Now, if you got enough of that wind, some of it turns out to be capacity. Capacity means what machine or what kilowatt, what electric power is available for your peaks. Wind can't do that unless there's a whole lot of it. And but then it's still it only produces something when the wind is blowing. Mm-hmm. The wind doesn't blow all the time. Yeah. Anyhow, that's. You don't need this education.
Well, I'm looking.
I'm not sure it's education, but there's a common. When the people say, "Oh, I got that great big windmill," when the wind is blowing.
Mm-hmm. What about some of you've talked about Art Jones and Ken Holm and Virgil Hanlon. What about some of the other people that were involved at that time? Al Hoffey, Fred Simonton, some of those folks.
Yeah.
What sort of people were they?
Al Hoffey is a leader, but because we didn't get public power districts in the first instance, then we went into the Basin thing. From 1952 on, other than a couple times in the state legislature there was instances, but the issue then, and even now to a substantial degree, the issue then was power supply. We had there's state law about who the co-op servant, who that stuff. And Al was an effective leader and a wonderful guy, but that for what the SDREA was doing, but the SDREA wasn't the agency or the organization that had any didn't have the responsibility or anything else on power supply, and power supply was the issue, and that sort of and SDREA did what was necessary in Pierre, but it was a different game. There were just two different organizations, and the leadership for the major need was East River in those days, and not the state association. Once in a while there'd be some state issue. That is, we needed one time a modification of the power district law, and that was kind of related to power supply, but Al Hoffey was a very important person in the first public power district fight. And I was thinking of one of the major other things that other person that made a difference in this whole thing was Ben Stong.
Mm-hmm.
Ben Stong came up with the idea for some congressional hearings on this power supply thing. The senator from North Dakota, Langer,
Mm-hmm.
Came up. He conducted hearings on the Ondal thing. He didn't have any jurisdiction.
Yeah.
George Cornog, who was a manager in distribution up in North Dakota, we were in there one time and went through this with him. And Langer said, well, we'll have a hearing. He didn't have any senatorial jurisdiction. He had a hearing, and it became a national thing because the same criteria affected all the other powers. But Ben Stong did a whole bunch of things necessary in there. He was on Metcalf's staff, and he could go to about 5 different senators. He could walk around on the floor of the Senate just like he was one of them. And he was a farmers' union guy in there at one time. Oh, he's editor of the paper.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And South Dakota, I always think of Art Jones, but there were Ben Radcliffe. I worked very closely with Ben.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of farmers. Oh, a Canton guy.
Leif
Lunder.
Yeah.
He was a...
Leif.
These guys, there were a number who were effective in Pierre. Leif Lunder was one, but Art was there too. Dick Knipe was Art's assistant. Did you know that?
No.
When Art was Democratic leader of the state senate, Dick Knipe was his assistant. He was number 2. What occurs to me is an element, I think, many times of the farm leaders. First of all, the farm leadership was developed in part because of the AAA program. Those county chairmen and so forth, they went around and talked to people. And in the process of it, that they became farm leaders at one time or another. And concurrent with that, incidentally, was in the 30s when there were CCC camps. The leaders, the people who ran that became cadre in World War II. Mm-hmm. They developed that leadership with the CCC guys to be corporals and sergeants and cadre. And there's no reason, incidentally, that we couldn't have the same thing now. You know, every forest in this country needs work, and when Jim Averisk was senator, I went through this routine with him, of course, and Hubert Humphrey introduced a bill, and it was law for a while, for jobs for young men to work in the forests, and I think they got a small appropriation one year, but nobody's picked up on it since. And, you know, it'd be a heck of a lot better for some of those kids in the city who don't have anything to do. It would be to put them to work in national forests for the work that needs to be done. They develop it was a good program, and that same idea still would be beneficial, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Getting back to the process of developing what now is the existing rural electric system in South Dakota and this whole area. What about roles did some of the South Dakota politicians play besides, you've talked a bit about Quentin Burdick from North Dakota, say people like George McGovern or Carl Munt or Francis Case, were they helpful or
in rural
or unhelpful? Or
oh, sure. Well, Senator McGovern is an example, quick example. In one of those Republican years, they were going to cut out the RA loan 2% program for power supply facilities. Mm-hmm. McGovern held hearings on that and knocked that idea down. And anything that South Dakota rural people were, I don't know if this is public knowledge, but there was a time when the farmers weren't interested in the weed support program, and it was Ben Stong who came up with the idea of a voluntary thing that saved that program. Mm-hmm. Well, he worked for McGovern at the time, or I don't know whether it was McGovern or Metcalf. I think it was McGovern, I think, because he was on the Ag Committee. And Doe went along with them at that juncture. But that voluntary wheat certificate thing was, again, it was Farmers Union, it was been a strong idea.
Mm-hmm. What about some of the other groups that, maybe are important and perhaps the average South Dakotan might not know about them? Midwest Electric Consumers Association, for example, what did they start out to do? What was their function?
It was to provide a regional organization to promote the philosophy of regional development of both water and power resources. The first professional was a guy named Lee, and then he was succeeded by Ken. And when we were going after the big one, the 1,000 kilowatt or whatever the hell it was, and that was the organization which promoted that basin concept then on a regional basis rather than just it was basin couldn't lobby at the time, but Midwest became the lobby spokesman for the regional development of all the resources. That was Harlan's idea.
Okay. How about the Heartland Consumers Power District? I think that was headquartered over at Madison and East River. What did they do?
Well, it was created in part because Harlan wanted I don't know, this isn't in print, but Heartland was created as a state organization to provide power for primarily, for municipalities and other public organizations. Mm-hmm. And but it was created in part to provide also a source of financing other than REA for those types of things. And it still does that, but without Heartland, there would be much more, probably a much higher cost of power supply for those who are now having the benefits of low cost financing. Mm-hmm. And so one of the last things was happening when I left East River. Okay. Heartland was created.
Yeah. One other yeah, go ahead.
It also ended the career of Frank Farrar. Do you know that story?
Go ahead.
Well, we were trying to get Heartland created as an alternative financing to REA in the case of East River. And in order, we'd gone, we had that Heartland proposed up to the point where it could function. There was a sentence in the old power district law that had to be changed before the prominent Wall Street firm that would finance, Heartland would use as a part of getting the money. We needed a slight amendment in the old law. Art Jones was then the minority leader in the state senate, and Frank Farrar was one of his Sunday school students, and we went. Art and I was with him in this period. Went to Frank and said, "We're having this guy coming out from New York City who is the expert on this, and we need this. We need this. We need this change in the power district law, and he's coming out here at our request, and we'd like you to meet with him on next Tuesday." And Frank said yes. over the weekend, Goldberg and the power company attorneys got a hold of Frank and got him to cancel that meeting. And as a result of that, in the next 2 weeks, we got enough petitions put on the ballot, and Frank didn't exist anymore, and that ended Frank's career. The Republicans helped cancel it because, but it was Art's leadership there again.
Mm-hmm. One of the other groups that I remember.
One of the other groups won.
One of the other groups that I remember was the Western States Water and Power Consumers Conference. What role did that play? Were you involved?
It was primarily then just not the Missouri Basin, but was the Northwest power districts in that group, and various Montana groups. But I think it went down as far as Arizona too. Mm-hmm. So it represented more than just the Dakotas and just a wider approach. Yeah. And it was incidentally there that first of all, Burdick stopped in Kennedy stopped in North Dakota. Then he went out to the Western States Power in the Billings, I think it was, mm-hmm. and Ben Stong was working then for the Democratic National Committee and was a part of the planning of that Kennedy thing. And Harlan was, I don't know where he was, but he wasn't in Madison. So Ben called me instantly. Don't put this in print. Ben called me and says, "What do you guys want?" So I typed back that we want development thermal, basically the basin idea. And Ben got that into that speech. And that commitment was Kennedy had the sense that to develop the lignite, the North Dakota resources, and as a part of the Kennedy speech, and this made it possible, made it not quite a dictum, but at least the thought then that was authorization that Udall could use for creation of the basin plan. Mm-hmm. And it was that idea that Kennedy needed something out west here, and this was another opportunity for Kennedy, besides North Dakota, but then it went to Billings, represented the Western States thing, which is a bigger thing, and Kennedy came through, of course, mm-hmm. and Udall came through. The minute Udall rejected the 14 power company proposal, it just changed to what it is today, essentially. Bigger than any of us imagined it would be at the time. Yeah. It's also the biggest cooperative coal thing, that was part of it.
When did you leave East River to go to work? You left the East River staff and went to work for Aberest? When was that?
I went to work for Joyce and Charles.
You did that first, okay.
And then I went to work for Frank Denham.
Oh, for Denham, okay.
But then He was impossible to work for.
Yeah.
Uh,
You.
Again, off the record. Can you? Don't type this up.
Yeah.
It was impossible to work for. We had a couple of assistant secretaries of agriculture come down to his office one time. He said, "I want my idea of a farm bill is based on bins, barrels, something along that line." And they just shook their head, got out of there. Then he had another one of us at the staff, Dave Blair, and said, do a bill up that if anybody was charged of death, killing anyway, a FBI agent, the sentence would automatically be death by a firing squad. Well,
He had been an FBI agent.
Everybody just shook their head in disbelief. He was a sponsor of the electric modification, RA legislation at one time. And he drafted a bill that the Ag chairman just shook his head about. And he said, "Here, Frank, introduce this." It was the NRECA bill. And behind his desk he had a state flag and USA flag, and his desk was up like 8 inches off the floor. So people came in there, they had to look up at him, He was kind of a nice guy in a way, but he was goofy. Dave Blair was on the staff at the same time. He's now attorney for Eastern.
And he served, 2 terms in the House?
One morning, he called all of his staff in. He said, "I was here until 3 o'clock last night," which was typical maybe. He went around to all of his staff's desk, took out all the pencils, and called his staff in. And he said, "I went through your desk last night, and you've got all these pencils and pens that you don't need." He said, "I've separated them out here. What you can do is pick out the shortest pencil and the pen ballpoint pen you think has at least least ink left in it, and you can use those. But none of you use these federal supply of felt tip pens. I use those for signing my letters. You don't need any of those." I couldn't get out of there soon enough, neither could anybody else. And one time I took his picture for I was writing press releases maybe, but I was doing whatever. And I took his picture once, and he had this great big goddamn lamp, and I was trying to get the whole desk, and I had to move it. I couldn't frame the picture without moving that. And the picture came out okay. Then a week later, he called me. I was in his office, and he said, "You weren't here. You took my picture, and you moved my lamp, but you didn't put it back." He was irrational. But building up that desk, so you're a foot higher. The guys that are really leaders and whatever, they don't sit behind that fucking desk. They get up and just sit next, like there. And so I went to work then for a thing called, it was a front end money thing for low cost housing.
Was that
RHIC, Rural Housing Electric Corporation, or independent, whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that for about 2 years.
Okay.
Then I worked for Jim.
Yeah, when did you go to work for him? When he went into the Senate, or was it later on?
Huh?
When you went to work for Jim, was it when he went into the Senate or later on?
Yeah, when we were promoting, East River was promoting this change in the power district law.
Mm-hmm.
There was we had a guy from Clear Lake who was a co-op attorney up there, I forget his name now. And then we needed one on the West River. Harlan was down in Florida. He was ill at the time. And so I could name the guy. We were organizing these petitions and so forth. We put Jim as the West River guy. And it kind of kept him alive for, it was an element at least. And but when he went in, I was still working for that housing thing downtown. And it was rural anyway. And Jim just called me up and said, "Hey, you want to come to work here?" And I said, "Oh, you already got one of us." Jody was working for him at the same time too. And I said, "Well, yeah." Then Wahi was still a political thing at the time.
Yeah.
Jim voted no on it and didn't tell. And but George McGovern stated that was Holmes' bet. That was his other drive, Ken's other drive. And environmentalists got into it, and his buddies up in Brown County. And we may still need that someday, but the water isn't going to be there this year.
No. You had, I think, in your book, you mentioned that that the completion of the Oahe project was important to maintaining affordable electric rates. Now they're starting to talk about because it didn't get built, raising rates. Do you still think that
you
that
mean
would have
the
been
current
helpful
issue
in keeping the rates down by developing that other project as an irrigation project to provide some additional? You're right. It's probably not going to happen, but
there was nothing in that proposed thing that the Senate turned down.
that's right.
That said that this money is going to be used for that.
Yeah.
It was just to pay for the war or whatever. It was just there was Minnewaconnie, however you say it, Minnewaconnie, that's just flat out appropriations without them. Just that comes out of it's just a budget item.
Yeah.
And but what happened historically, if I remember it right, is when Wahi was being proposed, there's the hydro rates. In order for Ken at that time, I'm not absolutely sure about all these numbers, but there was a time when Wahi was being considered, that the payout of it from hydro rates would have paid for why. And to get the chairman of the House Interior Subcommittee on that stuff from Colorado to approve it, Holm, when he was assistant secretary, raised hydro rates, like a tenth of a mil or something, to satisfy this guy. And I wrote a headline then in South Dakota Highlanders said, Holm raises rates for power. He read that back to me many times. But it was just, it would have paid East River's employee management of East River, but it wouldn't have done much more than that. But it was enough so that it would have. And he also extended the pay. The House Committee then, or whatever part of the law it got into, extended the payout to a number of years so that their numbers would come out. And when Carter was in, was it Carter? It had to be Carter. Was in Verge Jim and George went down to see that banker that he brought up. Went down to see him, and this banker said, "I know what you're here for." And Jim said, "Well, I'm not here for that wahi thing. I'm opposed to it." But he hadn't leveled with George. So that's kind of where it got killed. As for those Republican ranchers, they didn't give a shit.
What sort of a person was Jim Abrist to work for?
Fun. He was one of the most liberal guys probably the most liberal guy in the Senate. But he was always doing battles of various kinds. One of the things that I was had some experience with was he introduced a bill to vertically disintegrate the oil companies, or vertical, you know what I mean. They couldn't own oil well and the transmission line and the refinery and the gas stations all. That was vertical integration. Yeah, divestiture. Now, there's an interesting story there. That in that period, there was a number of attorneys working for the independent oil gang, and they said one time that at one time they had evidence sufficient enough so that the oil companies were violating antitrust laws, and they'd gone through this any number of times. There has never been a president yet, I don't think. No, there's never been a president yet that would do battle with the oil companies. And these guys were, this group of lawyers at this time said, we had it. but the president killed it. It's true of Lyndon Johnson. He was a lobbyist, but when Jim was still in there, he did promote a bill against horizontal integration. That's when you owned Montgomery Ward too, and he got that bill passed. You know, mobile was Montgomery Warding, and that bill passed, I'm pretty sure, and they can't own Montgomery Ward and Walmart and whatever else, horizontal integration. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of thing he did. But there's I don't remember exactly what. There was a type of program run where you could have fuel cells. You know what fuel cells are? That's you can have one of those right out here, and there was a bill to be introduced, and I suggested to Jim that he should be one of the sponsors, and it was like a Monday that the committee was going to act on this or something. And I said, I think you should be one of the sponsors. It's clean and whatever, you know. Mm-hmm. And he said, fine. And I said, I've written a statement for you, and you haven't read it yet. And he said, you wrote it and you read it. Is it okay? And I said, yeah. Well, he said, put it in. Didn't even bother to read it. You know, that's the kind of thing that made it fun to work for him. Yep. And he had bright staff. You know, Peter, what's his name, ended up with Tom's number one guy as Stavrianos. Yeah. You know about Stavrianos?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. If you want to talk about him a little bit, why go ahead.
He knows probably more about South Dakota politics than anybody in South Dakota. And but he was a great guy. And, yeah. His father, you know, was a famous Greek. And again, that's George McGovern's whatever. Mm-hmm. Peter Stavrianos was father, one of George's profs in Northwestern when he got his doctorate. Oh, okay. And that's how Peter Jr., or not, his father isn't Peter, that's how Peter Jr. ended up on McGov's staff for a while, and then later Jim's staff. Mm-hmm. And then on Tom Dashiell's staff. Mm-hmm. And he just, incidentally, Jody, my son Jody is a close friend of all those guys. You know Jody or know him.
What sort of relationship, you know, you've talked about Apparask, what sort of relationship did he have with the rural electrics during the time that he was in Washington?
Oh, primarily, he was the representative of, he was a spokesman for rural electrics on that change in the power districts law bill that the attorney and those two guys, and but anything he'd had a relationship with Fred Simonton and the rest of that Midwest gang before then too, but anything that I don't remember. Probably the main issue, the Rural Electrics, without exception, support water irrigation, and Jim didn't come through on that. But
Yeah. Aberest retired in 1979. What did you do then?
what?
What did you do after Aberest retired?
Oh, I went to work for Bill Manson in Pennsylvania. There was a thing called Allegheny Electric, which was the East River there, and a statewide. And I did a thing like I did for East River for Pennsylvania. And Bill also got into Wahi. Bill also got into hydro. There was some hydro potential. And Bill Masson's from Bellefouche. And he was he was the statewide guy, and he was also the East River guy, all in one up there. And I went to work for him as his exec or whatever, and worked on power supply and did a thing like Stepping Forward for them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
Called it a Miracle Blessing.
Mm-hmm.
No, did you ever see the big NRECA Miracle Blessing?
The 1985, the Dick Pence.
Oh, that great big thick, the desktop one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they sent me a copy of that from East River here a week or so ago.
Oh yeah. That was my last one of my fun things at REA. Dick Pence is from South. You know Dick Pence?
I know the name, and I probably met him. I don't know him real well.
Yeah, Dick Pence was from Brown County. I'll think of it in a minute. And he wrote a book called Two Shorts and a Long, Three Shorts and a Long, or something like that. You ever hear of that?
No, I haven't.
Oh,
I know what it refers to, but I...
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
He was in the Korean War and in the Navy, and he got back into shore after being gone for 18 months, and he called his father Carpenter. It's up there near Stephanie's gang.
Yeah.
And the operator said, "Well, what's the telephone number?" And Dick said, "Three shorts and a long." She said, "Are you kidding me? Whatever." And Dick had to argue with her, and 5 minutes. Instead, we had a poker club, and Dick was one of those, and he was telling me this story at a poker club, and he said, I told her it's Aberdeen to get. Call the operator and get me to my hometown there, and so she finally did, and I guess his dad's name was Robert. She said, this New York operator said, "What's the Robert Penn's telephone number?" She said, "It doesn't have a number. It's three shorts and a long." and so the operator said, "Where's connect me?" And operator said, "Well, no point in connecting you because he's not there. He's at the ball game." and she said, "It's halftime over there. Maybe they get him the phone." And so he did, and Dick said, "Hi, Dad." He says, "How's the weather out there?" And he told me this story, and I said, "Well, you dumb shit, write it." And he wrote it, and it's been published about 15 places. But it was a true story. Any day, Dick was primary editor of that big one. I forget whether I have it here.
Mm-hmm.
And for 6 months, Dick and I worked together on this. And what we did was look at photographs or negatives.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, say, show off our new toy here.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. That's neat.
I don't know if I've got it up here or not. Yeah, this one.
Oh,
The next greatest thing.
yes, yes. This is you got your name on the front of this, and you got lots
I
of
worked on it
signatures
6
in
months, and primarily what Dick and I did was
Well, let me just a second here. Let me shoot a picture of you with that. That was in 1985, was it? When you did that?
no, I forget. Pat Dahl worked for me, and I was Bob Ferrigan's legislative PR person or whatever.
Oh, okay.
And Patrick Dahl was working for Baseman. He came in and was on my one of my helpers, or whatever the hell I did. And he wrote a lot of this, but the only major thing, if any, that I contributed to this was Dick and I went through all these pictures. I bet we went through 6,000, wherever the heck they were, and we picked out the ones that appeared in here. But that Pat was writing this, and it was kind of came to a point where it needed a little organization. And up until about halfway through here, it's chronologic.
Mm-hmm.
And I suggested, well, from that point on, then do it item by item, function by function, whatever. And then that's how it came about.
It's a wonderful collection of pictures.
The next greatest thing, you know about the name of that? There was a rural electric director, I guess, down in Tennessee or something. He says, the greatest thing is the love of my God, and the next greatest thing is electricity on the farm. and it was, it came out pretty good, There's some great pictures in here. We didn't take them, I just picked them up.
Just a collection of some of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was really impressed. I don't know whether it's still in publication or not.
Yeah.
But,
It's, Bob Nelson was in the, Bob Nelson, you know Bob Nelson name?
yeah, sure. He was the first full-time South Dakota Farmers Union editor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's, saw him, spent time with him the last time I was in there. We have 4 kids. 3 sons, Jody, Jeff, and Scott. Jeff and Scott are still in there. And the last time we were in there was for, the North Dakota guy who was working for Ag. It's a name I know as well as my mother's. No, his father was GCA president, Olson.
Oh, yeah. Well, Raleigh Olson.
Raleigh, yeah.
Yeah, I know Raleigh.
Last time I was in there was for Maddie's retirement.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
And,
sure.
when I was in there, John Holm was working for Clinton earlier. Anyhow, it's kind of a fun story. It's not any use to you, but it might be interesting.
Sure.
John Holm went to this law firm that was managed by the guy that was Secretary of State, you know, and then his wife Barbara was working for that Save the Dirt gang, and Scott Lilly, John Holm, and Judy Harrington. Does Judy mean anything to you?
Yeah.
You know Judy?
I know Judy.
She lives
I
Hill
haven't seen
City.
her for a long time, but I know her.
She lives Hill City now. Those three were the first three that had a desk in the McGovern presidential thing. Whatever. Well, John Holm and Scott Lilly. John played banjo. And Scott Lilly played guitar or whatever, vice versa. And I played bass horn and bass fiddle in bands and stuff earlier. And so I had an old bass fiddle I brought in, and there were three of us. Then the fourth of us was Scott Lilly's employer, Dave Obie. And he played harmonica. And then we got a couple other guys. We had this bluegrass thing, and because Dave Obie was on it, well, we played the demo club a lot and had fun. Anyhow, John now has, when he was with Clinton, he had undersecretary status in state. He was the disarmament guy.
Yeah.
Wolfowitz was his predecessor there, and John went to Russia maybe 17 times with the president. And on the way on the Arab trips, Clinton wanted to play hearts, and so they played hearts. And John now has I don't know the technical name for it. It isn't a sailboat. It's a power-driven boat, big enough for 2 baths and 2 bedrooms. And
okay.
When Bush was elected, when Clinton got out of there wasn't everybody in undersecretary levels or policy level retired. When they're gone, there's laws where they just can't go to work for anybody. And John went to work for international. Went to work for an international group that delivered cargo. And I worked for them for about 2-3 years. Mary, this is Chuck Groth, who's been listening to my lies here.
You can see I've been painting. Time to sit down.
And Mary knows these stories. And everything was going fine. Had this nice $300,000 a year job, and everything was going fine. And the reason he got the job is that this guy that owned it was a Pakistani who'd immigrated to South Dakota, and his first planes were crowd dusting.
Okay.
And he had like 24 cargo planes. Then he had his private jet, and everything was going cool until one time he was flying with his potential client against. They both went down to it. Neither one of them came up again. They crashed. So the board of directors, John, went to them and they said, "John, we know why you're here and so forth, and you can be here, but we're not going to pay you. We'll pay you $150, but we're not going to." And they said, "But," he said, and then the board looked at him. John said, "Well, I think my contract says something. I got 6 months or so." And they looked at the contract and didn't know, "You have a whole year." So John retired, bought his big boat. He has a very nice house in Navy, Annapolis, and Barbara, and they're out on the ocean a lot of the time. And John gave Ken used to say when he was introduced, "Are you related to John anyway?" and his brother Ken, incidentally, is full prof. You know about that?
No.
Ken Fulham Jr. is full prof. Ancient history. Mm-hmm. He was instrumental in a big deal in Israel at some ancient seaport. And his wife is also an ancient historian. Mm-hmm. And he walked away from the Lutheran Church to be a Jewish, whatever the hell they are, and a Jewish religion. Mm-hmm. And Bob Holm, the youngest, no, not the youngest, he's next to the youngest, is the pastor of the biggest Lutheran church in the D.C. area, right downtown. You've been to D.C. a number of times. Yeah. Right off DuPont Circle down there.
Okay.
Bob Holm is the pastor there. All right. And the youngest one, I'll think of it in a minute.
Is there
maybe.
A Charles Holm?
Developed in software when he was out of college.
Yeah.
For banks, for some reason.
Oh, okay.
Retired when he was 45.
Yeah.
And he lives in Colorado Springs.
Mm-hmm.
Margaret, the one daughter, is a medical technician, retired now.
Okay.
Anyhow, the whole family. Mm-hmm. I think it's a farm thing partly. Yeah. All five of these had at least 1 year in a rural school a mile from their home. Mm-hmm. And then they all went to high school, public high schools in D.C. And then they all went to college. Mm-hmm. But I think it says something. If there's any rationale, I think, for preserving small towns and family farms, it's that we produce, that is, we being rural America, produced leaders that, the list is a long list, mm-hmm. and it's worth the cost of the wheat program or whatever the hell it is, because that's where the leadership of this country has come from, and not only the leadership that the bright guys, like the guy from Kent, who, the nuclear guy, and we're losing that. Mm-hmm. Among other things, we developed George McGovern, we developed Tom Daschle, and North Dakota's, incidentally, I don't know, our daughter Lynn has taught English comp at Bismarck State College for 25 years.
Okay.
Ardell, her husband, was Pat Comey's assistant.
Mm-hmm.
Pat Comey is a federal judge. But there was a lawyer from up by Grand Forks who was also in that Nodland firm with Ardell and Pat Comey. And his parents had a farm up around Grand Forks. And they lost a tractor. They had to get airplane, find one of their tractors. It's a goddamn big farm.
There's some big farms.
Yeah. I don't think I've told you anything you haven't known before you came. I appreciate having this.
Yeah. What kind of?
I think I'll do with this.
Yeah.
I don't. It's possible Joyce Conrad doesn't have one.
So that's possible. That's possible.
And she did this.
I'm pretty sure John does. You mentioned John Holm. I'm pretty sure he does have a copy of it.
Oh, does he?
Because he
Okay,
has
yeah.
come to a fundraiser that the foundation did in Washington.
Joyce and Charlie did the North Dakota one.
Yeah.
Joyce and Joyce and Charles.
I think I met Charles. I know Joyce better because she worked for National for a while.
They had the Mandan Pioneer, and they financed 3 or 4 Conrads with it.
Yeah.
But they always had the silly notion that they could compete with the Bismarck Tribune.
Yeah.
If they used this for western South Dakota, and they could have could probably still be publishing a paper up there.
Yeah.
Well, they thought they wanted to be a statewide paper.
Yeah.
Or
They didn't
Bismarck
have the
Tribune, you couldn't beat the
resources,
Tribune. Do you know the publisher who's the editor of the Grand Forks?
Mike Jacobs.
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah.
No, he's a very close friend of our son-in-law and Lynn.
Okay, yeah, I worked on I was worked with him a couple of years on the student newspaper.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, we spent 2 nights a week sitting around when he was editor there.
Was you reporting?
Yeah, I had various editor jobs and reporting too. I was copy editor one year.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and did a lot of headline writing. They hand me a sheet of paper and say, write ahead for this at so much length, and
that was my first job at the Madison Leader was the desk, we had. You remember Fairchild engravers? It was a thing you put on a circular disc, and you put the picture on this disc, and then it would send an impulse to a needle that went like this into the plastic thing going around there, reproduce the picture. And you'd mount that on a type high, less the thickness of the plastic, rather than going through the engraving thing with lead and all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'm almost to the end of the interview here. Is there anything you'd like to add that you hadn't mentioned before or that we hadn't gotten into?
What's going to be the kind of theme or whatever of the book you're working on?
Well,
or this project, whatever.
Yeah, I think the idea is to collect the life stories of a lot of people involved in the cooperative movement and kind of see how are they same, how are they different.
The one thought that occurred to me while I was doing this, which I think is not significant, is typical, perhaps is a better word, that farmers as a group, I think probably true now. The nature of their work is they're going up and down these fields, maybe listening to some music or something, or listening to the radio. But while they're doing that, unlike a lot of professions, they've got time. They can think. They can think, and they can think about what's happening from the news. And I think their opportunity is to be better informed than a lot of us. They look at the tube too, but they've got all day then to the things could go through their mind, and most of us in our work don't have that. We go from 4:30 to the tube and maybe read the newspapers or scratch something. But I think it's endemic isn't a word, but you know what I'm trying to say. That I think that's what made them probably better informed as a group, and it also probably was a factor in their being civic farm leaders, because they can come home and think about things, and I don't. That's either a luxury or it's you have to be wealthy to do that. But then you're not thinking about what's happening in the world or happening on the farm, and because they have that advantage. They've got time to think. Unfortunately, in South Dakota, 60% of them, maybe 75%, they don't think long enough before they vote Republican. Something happened there. I don't know what the number. What kind of percentages are these days, do you think?
Oh, it's hard to say.
It's hard to. Are there any numbers available?
Well, there are numbers available for registered people, but I don't know that it doesn't break down by profession or what they do.
Whether they're a small town or.
Yeah. I would guess that that is that edge. Whether it's a 75 or not, I wouldn't know for sure.
But in South Dakota Farmers Union, what would you guess? How many of those voted for Bush?
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised, but what, a quarter or a third, certainly, maybe more than that. Maybe,
how much?
Maybe a quarter of them, maybe a third of them.
Oh, was that all you think?
It may have been higher than that. I don't know.
Yeah.
We really don't have any way of knowing.
Oh, yeah, well,
we don't survey them.
Elkton farmer or whatever,
Yeah.
Was he Farmers Union? The guy that ran against Sophie?
No.
Yeah, he was Farm Bureau.
I think maybe at this point it might be a good idea to put a closing line on here. We've been visiting with Harlan Severson. Thank you for taking part in the Cooperative Legacy Project.